This is the start of our three-week Noah series. And if you haven't seen the movie Noah, you may not fully understand where the controversy comes from, but it's earned close to $100 million at the box office. It stars Russell Crowe, Anthony Hopkins, Jennifer Connelly, and Emma Watson. The director is Darren Aronofsky, who directed such children's films as Pi and Black Swan. And so he's known for directing dark movies, and that's true of Noah as well. The movie was controversial immediately on its release. Can we just do a quiz here? How many people have seen the movie? All right, we'll say a third. About a third of people have seen the movie. There are going to be some spoilers in this series. I don't want to ruin it for you too badly, but it was controversial from the start. A lot of church-going Christians were split in their assessment of the movie, while critics gave the movie a 76% on RottenTomatoes.com. According to Time magazine, the founder of the Creationist Museum in Kentucky called Noah the worst film I've ever seen. Ultimately, there is barely a hint of biblical fidelity in this film. It is an unbiblical, pagan film from its start. On the other hand, there's a guy named David Buckner, who is a blogger in Canada who I believe is a six-day creationist, just like the director of the Creation Museum. But David Buckner published a blog, 30 ways, a blog post, 30 ways that the Noah film is biblical. Interesting. So even among pretty conservative Christians, there is a split opinion about the movie. But not only did the movie create controversy, it also created a conversation. And the online Bible software site YouVersion reported that right after the opening weekend, searches for the Noah story at YouVersion jumped by 300%. I saw an interview with Russell Crowe a couple of weeks ago where he's a pretty devout Catholic. If you don't know this, Russell Crowe has a consecrated Catholic chapel on his property. Like he invited a priest, and he's like a real Catholic church on his property. And he said for him, the value it was a conversation starter. As he made the movie, he understood that, well, some people may not like it, but it's going to start conversations about the Bible and get people talking about these issues, and he was definitely right. And so I was debating, I had a plan, for what I was going to do for a sermon series after Easter, and I was kind of debating this a few weeks ago, going back and forth, and I went to meet with a couple here in the church, and the first thing they asked me was, have you seen the Noah movie? And they just wanted to talk about it and ask questions about it, and that helped to push me over the edge. So people have all kinds of questions about the movie and the Bible. So what in the movie was from the Bible and what wasn't? Where did the material not in the Bible come from? Why has it gotten the negative reaction it's gotten from some Christian groups? And then on top of that, the movie has re-raised a lot of the traditional questions that people had about, the Noah and the flood story. Did a worldwide flood really happen? We live in the scientific age. What does modern science say about a global flood? If it didn't happen, what does that say about the Bible? If it did happen, what does that say about God? Would God really destroy the world? I mean, that's kind of a big claim, right? That God would destroy the world. So if a hurricane hits the United States and a televangelist says, well, that hurricane hit the United States because God's judging certain groups of people, is he right? Because that apparently is what the Noah story says. So there are all kinds of questions. Is that what God's really like? And is there anything we can learn from this flood story? Is it relevant in any way, shape, or form to 21st century Americans? And so we're going to answer those questions in this series, and we're going to answer a lot more, actually. And we're going to find out that this ancient story from the Bronze Age is extremely relevant, sometimes uncomfortably relevant to our lives where we sit in 2014. So in this series, we're going to talk about handling conflict in your life. We're going to talk about it today, actually. How do you deal with conflict in your life, and what are the ramifications of your choices? We're going to talk about raising kids next week. And the Noah story speaks to that. Relational boundaries, second chances in life, self-confidence, caring for the earth, violence, knowing God's will, having hope in the future instead of being cynical. This Bronze Age account of a global flood speaks incredibly relevantly to our lives, and we're going to discover that in this series. So we're going to jump in right now by reading the first part of the flood story from Genesis 6. If you have a Bible, a paper one, or a phone one, go ahead and join us. Genesis chapter 6, starting with verse 5. The Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. Now, check this out. The Lord regretted. Is your picture of God that God has regrets? The Lord regretted that he had made human beings on the earth, and his heart was deeply troubled or grieved. So the Lord said, I will wipe from the face of the earth the human race I have created, and with them the animals, the birds, and the creatures that move along the ground, for I regret that I have made them. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. And then verse 9, this is the account of Noah and his family. Noah was a righteous man, blameless among the people of his time, and he walked faithfully with God. Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight and was full of violence. God saw how corrupt the earth had become, for all people on earth had corrupted their ways. So God said to Noah, I'm going to put an end to all people, for the earth is filled with violence. Notice the repetition of corruption and violence there. I am surely going to destroy both them and the earth. So make yourself an ark of cypress wood, kind of like a floating house, an ark of cypress wood. Make rooms in it and coat it with pitch, tar, inside and out. Verse 17, I'm going to bring floodwaters on the earth to destroy all life under the heavens. Every creature that has the breath of life in it, everything on earth will perish. But I will establish my covenant or agreement, deal with you. And you will enter the ark, you and your sons and your wife and your sons' wives with you. You are to bring into the ark 2 of all living creatures, male and female, to keep them alive with you. 2 of every kind of bird, of every kind of animal, and every kind of creature that moves along the ground will come to you to be kept alive. You are to take every kind of food that is to be eaten and store it away as food for you and for them. Noah did everything just as the Lord commanded him. So Noah and the ark is one of the most popular children's stories that we have, right? I mean, you see all kinds of kids' ministries decorated. You see a floating, a boat with like giraffes sticking out of it and elephant trunks, and it's this really cute story. This is one of my son's books, the story of Noah, and it talks about, God calling Noah, and Noah was good. Noah builds a boat, like he has boat blueprints right here, and he's being helped by a bear who's holding a hammer, and all the animals are coming, and he's helping to take care of them on the ark, and look at all the cute animals. And it's a really cute story. It just leaves out the part where everybody dies. And so we have this idea that the Noah story is this cute children's story. And the director of the Noah movie, Darren, said, this is a really scary story. And it is. Isn't it interesting what we do? I mean, the animals make it cute, and I get it. But it's actually a really dark, challenging story about some of the deeper issues of the darkness of the human heart, and how things can go badly in the world. And so every week, I want to answer, a couple of questions about the movie, and can speed through those, and then get to, well, what is this story, if it's not just the cutesy kids story with a boat and giraffes and elephants sticking out of the boat, what could it mean to us? So let's jump in. So first of all, I want to answer 3 questions today about the movie. Why was it so controversial? What about the rock monsters? If you haven't seen the movie, rock monsters, and Noah's vegetarianism and the environmentalist message in the movie. So first, why was it so controversial? I think it's fair to say that the major complaint some Christian groups had about the movie was that it wasn't biblical. And I'm using air quotes for people listening on the podcast. It wasn't biblical because that's determined by how you define biblical, right? By biblical, the folks who panned the movie generally said it doesn't follow the details of the story. There are things in the movie that are not in the Noah story. Therefore, it's not biblical. And I get their point. A lot of times, if you read a book first and you see the movie, first of all, the movie's never as good as the book, right? So you kind of see that one coming. But I understand if somebody's used to a story and it doesn't really follow all the details and it adds other stuff, it takes creative license, artistic license, I can see why there could be a complaint there. But the definition of biblical is important. While many Christians think that not following all the details is unbiblical, there's a whole tradition of wrestling with the Bible and asking questions about it that goes back hundreds and hundreds of years that could very much be called biblical. It's called midrash. And it was the practice of ancient Jewish rabbis asking questions, wrestling with the text of the Bible, and filling in gaps with some imaginative stories, and then having a living, dynamic faith wrestling with the text of that story. So a movie reviewer in Chicago named Ben Sachs wrote this at chicagoreader.com. It was a review called Darren Aronofsky's Noah tells the story by the book. The director's religious blockbuster is immersed in Judaic literature, Jewish literature. Here's what he writes. In the months since Paramount Pictures released Noah, countless newspapers and websites have published essays explaining and often debating its fidelity to traditional Jewish texts. It's common knowledge now that Darren Aronofsky and Ari Handel based their screenplay not only on the story of Noah and the flood, as it appears in the Torah, or Pentateuch, first 5 books of the Bible, but on the many tales and scholarly interpretations it has inspired throughout Jewish history. They also consulted with rabbis and scholars from multiple Judaic denominations. Collectively, these exegeses, which means interpreting the Bible, created by Jewish sages to explain ambiguous passages in the Torah, are referred to as midrash. Originally a Hebrew word meaning to seek out, to search, to ask questions, to search for the truth. Written over thousands of years, midrashic texts have filled dozens of books, which makes this body of literature many times larger than the Torah itself. And you thought Peter Jackson had his hands full with Lord of the Rings. So these ancient Jewish rabbis wrestled with the text of the Bible, asking questions, imagining stories to fill in the gaps, and they recorded this. And the director and the writers consulted some of this material. So a lot of, or maybe all actually, of what is not in the Noah story in the Bible, but it's in the movie, comes from other stories in the Bible, or it comes from ancient Jewish mystical texts. What the directors and screenwriters didn't do in their defense was they didn't just pull things out of thin air. They consulted other Bible stories and folded them into the Noah story, or consulted midrash to help fill in the gaps. So the controversy is, well, how do we relate to the Bible? As we talk about here all the time. If every single word comes from God, then it's going to be really important that you follow the details in the movie, I guess. If it's okay to wrestle with the text of the Bible and ask questions and honestly express your doubts and try to figure out what it means and hold some things in tension, well, then maybe you might be okay with this Noah movie. Does that make sense to everybody? It's the thing we talk about here all the time. Fundamentalist religion says, no, it's certainty, it's black or white, that's the way it was, and there's nothing else. But that's not the tradition of the Jewish rabbis, who apparently felt like questions and doubts were welcome. And they wrestled with the text, and it was called midrash. So, all right, what about the rock monsters? If you haven't seen the movie, I don't want to, we're totally spoiling it for you, but I'm trying not to that bad. But the rock monsters are like these big walking rock beings with transformer voices. Would that be fair? It's like Optimus Prime made out of rock. And so people are like, well, where does that come from? Well, that's one of the creative licenses that the directors took. But again, it's an example of midrash. Before the passage we just read, Genesis 6:1-4 speaks of beings who were on the earth. They're referred to as sons of God, which usually in the Old Testament means angels, actually. In the New Testament, usually Jesus, but in the Old Testament, angels. And then in verse 4, the Hebrew word for the offspring of these angels and mortal women are Nephilim. The word is Nephilim. No Bible scholar in the world has any idea what Nephilim means. Right? So it's the old King James Version translated it as giants. The NIV that many people use now would translate it as great men of renown. Like maybe they're like ancient hero, like almost like Hercules kinds of figures. Maybe they're really big people. Nobody really knows what the Nephilim are. Well, there you go. The directors did some midrash with the Nephilim, and voila, rock monsters. Now, it's based in the Genesis passage, but then they also brought in some Jewish mystical texts. It's called the Book of Enoch, written about 300 BC, and it speaks of these angelic beings called the Watchers. And they combined this Book of Enoch text with Genesis 6, a little creative license, and there you go with the rock monsters. Do you see the difference, though, in fairness to the movie, between people who are like, that's just unbiblical, and directors who consulted rabbinic sources and other Bible stories and tried to fold those into their screenplay? Do you see the difference there? You think that's a significant difference? I think so. All right, so why vegetarianism and environmentalism? In the movie, Noah and his family are vegetarians, and the director is a vegan, and that message comes across pretty strongly in the movie. Now, as we've said before in this church, we realize that a good percentage of Christians in America also have some pretty strong political views, that religion and politics are tied together closely in the United States. And the truth is, and it's very evident from blogs that have been written and reviews that have been written by various Christian groups, that many U.S. Christians view vegetarianism and the environmentalist movement as liberal. That's caring about the environment is liberal, and this is just another example of liberal Hollywood propaganda, trying to get me to not eat steak anymore. Or so, there are people who have this view that, well, first of all, it came out of Hollywood, so that's the first strike against them. But anything that shows a concern about the earth could be a liberal cause. I wonder how many Christians were aware that Genesis says that Noah and his family were vegetarians. In Genesis chapter 9, verse 3 through 5, God tells Noah and his sons, everything that lives and moves, this is after the flood, everything that lives and moves about will be food for you. Just as I gave you green plants, now I give you everything. So according to the text, Noah and his family become omnivores after the flood. But before the flood, they were vegetarians. So the director and the screenplay writers were paying attention to that detail in the story. Now, yes, the environmentalist message comes through very strongly, but God does save the animals, too, on the ark, correct? And so you can see, well, it's based in the text, even if we might disagree about how strong the messages are, it's still based in the text. Last week I told you about how I loved to take walks with my grandpa in the woods when I was a little boy. My grandpa owns 72 acres of woods and forest in southeastern Ohio. My grandpa was not a liberal by any stretch of the imagination. He would never be accused of being a liberal, but he loved the outdoors. Oh, my word. He would prefer, if he could have lived outdoors his whole life, he would have done it. And my grandma made him live in the house. He would have lived out in the forest if he could have. My grandpa, far from being a liberal, had an immense love for creation and a respect for life. Is it possible that because Christians believe that God is the creator and this is God's creation, and Genesis tells us that we're to be caretakers of it, is it possible that Christians ought to be the people who care the most for the environment that we live in? If we believe that it has a purpose and that it came from God and God saw that it was good, wouldn't it be almost expected that people who believe that would be the best, most concerned caretakers of the planet? I wonder why it is that so many Christians view caring for the planet as a liberal cause. Is it because of their interpretation of the Bible, or is it because of political views? Which one is it? Okay, so just some questions. Next week we'll address some more questions about the movie. But I want to move on to how could this Noah story be relevant to our lives in 2014? About 5 years ago, a buddy of mine was playing a bar gig. He writes and records his own music. And he was looking for a rhythm guitarist to play with him in this gig. And I'm like, so I tried out for the gig, and he picked somebody else. I'm still a little bitter, but I'm working on it, all right? And so he picked somebody else over me, and just to play backup guitar that night, but I still went to the gig, and I wanted to see him play. Well, during the gig, the guy they picked to play guitar, I think he got a head start on getting loaded before the gig ever started. And so in between songs, in between sets, he's just running through beers, just slamming them down one after the other. So, halfway through the night, he's pretty much hammered, flubbing chords. And so it was like my vindication. I would have at least been a sober guitarist. Not the best, but a sober one. And so in between sets, the guy came and sat down next to me. And he's like, "So what's it like being a pastor?" And so that's his way of starting a conversation, right? And so we were talking for a few minutes about it, and he's like, "You know what?" He's like, "I like Jesus, but you can keep the whole Noah and the ark thing." And he repeated himself. And you know how if somebody's been drinking a lot, like they might belch, but you're not sure if it's going to be just a belch. Do you know what I mean? And so he repeated, and he's like, "Yeah, you can keep that whole Noah." And it almost blew chunks on me. Like it was really close. The ark almost turned into a barf. And so that was his opinion on Noah and the ark. And we talked about it for a few more minutes. Now notice he said he likes Jesus. It's important to know, right? But he said, you can keep that whole Noah and the ark thing because, as he explained, modern science, of course, and it's true, the consensus of modern science is that there is no evidence of a global flood, and that he just kind of passed off the story. He had no use for that. If science has a doubt about that, then there's no value in this. Man, come on, that's for like people, you pastors can talk about that. But he made it very clear he had no use for Noah and the ark. He saw no relevance to it. It's unfortunate, but many people have pitted the Bible against science, and there are people like him who they like Jesus, but they think of Christians as people who are anti-science or anti-intellectual. And so it's a piece of this. It's not all we're going to talk about today, but it's a piece of it. So how is Noah and the flood relevant to our lives? First, if you're keeping notes, is it scientific truth or is it relational truth? There's a place for you to write down sermon notes in your worship handout if you'd like to. Is it scientific or relational truth? It's the first question that people have about the flood. Did it really happen? As described in Genesis. Genesis chapters 1 through 11 are known as primeval history. We don't know when the stories there are reported to have taken place, and we don't know when they were first written down. They are different. They read differently than the rest of Genesis and the rest of any other biblical literature. They're primeval history. They have an epic, larger than life, and yes, sometimes legend-like quality to them. There are 4 stories: Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, Noah and the flood, and the Tower of Babel. And they're great children's stories. You hear those in One Church Kids. But Genesis 1 through 11 is different than the rest of the Bible. There is a setting given, however, that is very helpful to us. In Genesis chapter 2, we're told that the Garden of Eden is between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. And we know where that is. Genesis gives us a setting. It's what was called Mesopotamia, which you remember from school. Mesopotamia is the cradle of Western civilization. And that's the setting for Genesis 1 through 11. In chapter 12, we're introduced to Abram, who becomes Abraham, and he migrates from Mesopotamia to the Promised Land, what is now Israel. So here's some things we know about Mesopotamia. Written history began about 3100 BC, so 5,000 years ago. Mesopotamian civilizations were established thousands of years ago. It's a very old civilization. The Mesopotamians excelled in science for their day, in mathematics, astronomy. Our 60-second minute, 60-minute hour, and 24-hour day comes from the Mesopotamians. That's our clock because it was their clock. They had a view of the earth, however, that was different from our view of the earth. They didn't have any weather satellites. And here we have a chart, I think, or a graphic of how they conceived of the earth. You may not be able to see all the fine print, but you can see the gist. In the middle, you have land. You have earth. They're the brown stuff. And above that, you have the sky and the clouds and the sun and the stars. And then above them, there's this vault. There's this solid object. And we read this straight out. It's Genesis 1. That God separated the water above the earth from the water below the earth by this vault and dry land. It's just straight out of Genesis 1. And it was also a Mesopotamian view of the universe, cosmology. And you see, Sheol is the underworld. That's what it means, underworld, netherworld. It's where people go when they die. It's under the earth. You have the land and the mountains. and you have water above the earth and below the earth. Look at all that water. That's a lot of water. And this was a Mesopotamian view of the earth, and that view finds its way into Genesis. Now, to the Mesopotamians, large bodies of water are frightening. These are desert people. Mesopotamia looks a lot like here, actually. There's not a whole lot of beach, and so they're just not sea people in Mesopotamia. They saw water as frightening as this chaotic mass of unpredictability and chaos. You just don't know what's going to happen in the sea. Picture waves crashing. That is the picture of earth that we encounter in Genesis 1:1 in the beginning. The earth was formless and void, and the Spirit of God or a wind of God hovered over the deep, it says. This mass of this endless water. And then God creates and separates the waters from the waters. It's a Mesopotamian view of the world. So 10 generations after creation, we're introduced to Noah. He's 600 years old when he built the ark. Long lifespans are also a characteristic of Mesopotamian literature. We have access to other writings from Mesopotamia, and the people live really, really long lives. We know from archaeology that the average life expectancy for a Mesopotamian man was really about 40 years. But it's an aspect of Mesopotamian literature. Noah builds an ark, a floating house that measured 300 cubits long. A cubit is the distance from your elbow to the tip of your middle finger. It's about 18 inches. So the ark would have been about 450 feet long. Several of these gyms, 75 feet high. And again, from archaeology, the largest boats discovered are Egyptian sailboats from that time period, about 170 feet long, which is a really big boat, but a lot smaller than the ark. And then Genesis 7 reads, in the 600th year of Noah's life, on the 17th day of the second month, on that day all the springs of the great deep burst forth, and the floodgates of the heavens were opened, and rain fell on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. What are the springs of the great deep? What are those? You ever seen one? Like a geyser, like Old Faithful or something? But you'd need like a really powerful Old Faithful to flood the world, right? Well, in our view of the world, springs of the great deep, we're just not sure what that means. In this view of the world, it makes perfect sense, doesn't it? There's a lot of water down there. And springs of the great deep can burst forth. So the rain above the water above comes crashing down as rain, and the water below comes bursting forth out of the great springs of the deep. And the water comes up on the surface of the earth, and it says the water was, we can stay there, it's okay. It says the water rose to 15 cubits higher than the highest mountain. Well, for us, that would be Mount Everest, which is 29,029 feet. And 15 cubits is 20 feet. So that tells us the flood waters covered the entire globe at a depth of 29,049 feet. From our view of the world, we know that would take about 3 times the amount of water currently in the oceans to do that. But in this view of the world, it makes perfect sense, doesn't it? Everybody with me? You're not ready to go to the bounce house yet? Okay? In that view of the world, it makes perfect sense. So, these are facts, and I've discovered that when it comes to these scientific questions, the opinion that people hold after my sermon is a lot like the opinion people hold before my sermon. I'm not nearly as persuasive as I used to think I was. And so I've discovered that people kind of have their opinions about the Bible and science and how they're going to relate these stories to our modern understanding of science and our modern understanding of the world. I would contend that if Christians choose to battle with science, they miss the point of these biblical stories. These biblical stories were not written to do battle with modern science, but it really is about relational truth. That anything we read in Scripture, it's about the relationship between God and human beings and all of creation. And this story is the same. So, in the rest of the sermon, we'll see, is the story of Noah true to life? Is it relationally true in your life right now, in the things you were feeling anxious about when you walked in this morning? Is it true to our lives? So here's the reason that God sends the flood. We already read the scripture. It says, now the earth was corrupt in God's sight and was full of violence. And then the words corrupt and violence are repeated. Corruption and violence. So if you were to say, God, why was there a flood? Corruption and violence. The Hebrew word for violence is Hamas. You've probably heard of that in the news. It can mean physical violence, physical wrong. It also can mean ethical wrong. It can mean the harsh treatment of other people. It can mean cruelty. It can mean injustice, when things in society just aren't fair. And there's a lack of justice and righteousness. It can mean oppression. It can mean actions that violate the rights of other people. It can mean murder, obviously, and lots of other things. That's violence. The Hebrew word for corrupt is sahat. It means to destroy, to decay, to spoil, to rot, to pollute, to waste, to be against what is good. It's connected to evil. And there's an interesting thing here in Genesis 6:7, when God says, I'll wipe away from the face of the earth every living thing I've made. Wipe away in English is the same word for corrupt. So it's like the corruption that human beings have caused has become so corrupt that it's corrupted creation. And now they're going to be corrupted because of their corruption. It's like a cycle. In other words, this is kind of abstract and heady. But the belief behind the Noah and the flood account is that God doesn't have to send the flood. God doesn't have to just randomly say, I gotta ixnay these people. How am I going to do it? Oh, I know, water. That's not the theology behind the flood. Remember, what does water represent to the ancient Mesopotamians? It was only 5 minutes ago, guys. Come on, indulge me. Chaos. Thank you. One person. Chaos. And in God's creative work, when God saw that it was good, he separated chaos from chaos. God created boundaries that we're going to talk about next week. And he put the chaos in its place, and he ordered the universe. And it brought goodness and beauty out of that chaos. Well, the idea behind Noah and the flood is the actions, the corruption, the violence of human beings is causing creation to come undone. It's opposing God's goodness, opposing God's order, opposing God's beauty, opposing the way that human life was created to be lived. And they're dehumanizing other people, and they're ruining the planet. And because that's happening, all of this chaos that God held at bay is now going to come back in crashing on top of them. That's the idea behind Noah and the flood. That's why it's a flood. That's why there's water involved. If you're keeping notes, unresolved conflict causes chaos. I could also throw in there corruption, but it would have been like 4 C's instead of 3, and I'm trying to be that cheesy, right, with this massive alliteration. Not funny at all. That's fine. It's great. Moving on. Unresolved conflict causes chaos. Corruption causes chaos. Corruption being destroying, wasting, polluting, dishonesty. Unresolved conflict being, I'm harboring feelings against people. I don't like them. They did something to hurt me. And it's unresolved. And now that's going to have a natural effect in my life. There are going to be natural consequences, and it's going to affect the rest of creation. It's going to affect my job. It's going to affect how I treat my kids. It's going to affect how I treat my dog. It's going to affect everything in my life because I'm harboring unresolved conflict, which is a form of violence, even if it's not physical violence. It's that Hamas word can mean social violence. It's just unresolved conflict. It can create chaos in my life. And so if we just apply Noah and the flood to, let's say, the larger picture over the past 12 years in the United States, there were some laws changed. Some people on Wall Street wanted to make deals, and some people on Main Street wanted to buy houses. And you could get a house really cheap, and everybody could qualify. And you can get the granite countertops, and you can pay later, buy now and pay later. And then lots of people on Wall Street getting rich, selling those bad mortgages. And everybody was like, hey man, I'm just going with the flow. It's just like, I'm just one drop of water, just going with the flow, man. Everybody's doing it. It's legal. It's happening. And then what happened? When you have millions of drops of water just going with the flow, what does that create? A flood. And we experienced that flood of the housing crisis and the recession of 2008 that we're still recovering from because of corruption and greed. And that's an example that we've experienced in 2003. And everybody has their views, and that's fine, but it's just a part of U.S. history now. Our public was convinced, maybe the government thought this was the case, maybe they didn't, but that Saddam had weapons of mass destruction. And we launched a war that turned into an 8-year war. We're not really sure how many people died, Americans and Iraqis, nearly bankrupted the United States. Claims were made that Iraq shared some of the blame for 9/11. And we launched a war against Iraq that lasted for 8 years. And the truth of the matter is, a lot of evangelical Christians didn't really question that decision. Now, we know better, in hindsight's 2020. But at the time, a lot of evangelical Christians didn't question that decision. Do you know where Mesopotamia is now? Where this story is set, when violence and corruption brought all this chaos, it's in Iraq. The Tigris and the Euphrates rivers, they're in Iraq. Ancient Mesopotamia is Iraq. I wonder what would have happened if people who talk about their love for the Bible and how the Bible is inspired by God, if they would have taken the Noah and the flood story and its setting a little more seriously. Would that have saved us lives and treasure? Maybe that's a controversial thing to say, I don't know, but do you follow me here? If we want to interpret the Bible as thinking people and take it seriously, well, this violence and corruption caused chaos in what is now Iraq. Could that have at least given us pause? Just a little more time to think before we as a people went in there. A few years ago, the issue of torture came up because of waterboarding. Maybe you remember that. And Senator McCain here, John McCain, opposed torture. He's been tortured in Vietnam, and he opposed torture. Well, there were some polls taken, and in May 2009, Christianity Today magazine published an article called Evangelicals and Torture. A new study says white evangelicals are most likely to justify torture. What shall we make of that? ? And the study found that when white evangelicals were asked about their support of torture, 18% of white evangelicals said the use of torture can often be justified. 44% said that the use of torture can sometimes be justified. Well, sometimes we can torture people. And that adds up to 62%. So 62% of people who carry a Bible around and are church attenders and who could have read that violence and corruption cause chaos, 62% supported torture. Am I just treading on thin ice here? I don't know, but we all live in this country together, and we all share in its decision making. So that's a big scale. But what about a personal scale in our lives? In closing here, is it relevant to our lives? Well, every relationship experiences conflict, and if you don't experience conflict, then it's not a real relationship. And it's marriage conflict, or if you're not married, you have family and friends and coworkers, and we have all kinds of opportunities for conflict. Sometimes family members do things we know it causes pain in their own lives, and that hurts us because they're hurting. Or sometimes they hurt us. Conflict is so common. Every pastor I know preaches regularly on a passage from Matthew 18. And if you've grown up in church, you've heard it so many times, you're like, oh, here he goes. He's going to talk about Matthew 18 now. The reason so many pastors preach on Matthew 18 so regularly is because so few Christians live it out. And it's very simple. Jesus gives instructions for how to deal with conflict in our lives. It won't be on the screen, but I'm going to read it for you. Matthew 18:15. If your brother or sister sins, go and point out their fault. Go to them and talk to them. Just between the two of you. If they listen to you, you have won them over. But if they will not listen, take one or two others along, so that every matter may be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. If they still refuse to listen, tell it to the church. And if they refuse to listen even to the church, treat them as you would a pagan or a tax collector. It's a very simple 3-step process. If somebody does something that offends you or hurts you, and you're tempted to harbor feelings of violence and corruption against them, you want to get back at that person, you don't like that person anymore, there's a grudge there, you feel offended and hurt. First, you go and talk to the person. This isn't on the screen, but you could write it down if you want. First, Jesus says, first you go and talk to the person. And you say, hey, when you did this, I felt this. In premarital counseling that I do, I say the word negotiation so many times when I meet with couples before they're married. Because it's all about saying, when you did this, I felt this, and negotiating and talking to a person about conflict. And if that doesn't work, you take 2 or 3 people with you to be an extra set of eyes and ears. because things have escalated to the point where a one-on-one conversation won't work anymore. And if those two steps don't work, then you distance yourself from the person. But if you can safely, you always leave open the possibility of reconciliation, if you can. Now, that just sounds so simple, doesn't it? So cliche. The truth of the matter is, when a pastor preaches that, very few people write it down. And it seems like such a simple concept, and here's what happens. That gets said in a sermon. A half an hour later, some conflict happens in the church. And folks will go to their friends and they'll build alliances and gossip. And instead of going to the person to talk, they'll go around and they'll create this whole battle between people based on avoiding and building alliances and getting people to agree with me to oppose those bad people over there, those brothers and sisters in Christ. And we'll distance ourselves from them, and it's going to turn into this big dramatic mess. And we all live it all the time, don't we? Don't we? Isn't it true? I'm speaking to myself too. And it just tears churches apart. Some of you are here this morning because you were hurt in church conflict, where it would have been so simple if somebody would have just gone to the person, as Jesus says, and said, hey, this happened, and I just wanted to clear the air. But the simple thing didn't get done. It doesn't say email the person. It doesn't say text the person. It says go to the person and talk with them. No matter how cliche it is, a pastor could give this sermon every single week, and it wouldn't be enough. Because I guarantee you, many of us will leave here and deal with conflict the same way we always have. And it has nothing to do with this process. So, as we close, the Noah and the flood story says to you and to me, we can create peace and goodness if we're willing to change our mind. If we're willing to change our mind in the way we relate to other people. Instead of violence and corruption, are we willing to change our mind? Here's an amazing thing that happens in this passage. We pointed it out earlier. It says that God regretted that he had made people. In the old King James, it's the word repent. God repented that he had made people. The word repentance is like the guy in the corner at ASU who has the sign, repent, turn or burn. He's got the bullhorn. I was down on campus a few years ago, and the guy with the bullhorn was like, some of you came here to drink tonight. And I'm thinking, everybody came here to drink tonight, man. Don't underestimate what's going on. So we hear the word repent in that context. Repent is a very loaded religious word. It simply means to change your mind. It means to change your mind, turn, change direction. I was going to deal with this person this way, build an alliance, harbor a grudge, manipulate, deceive, get everybody else on my side and oppose that person. I'm going to change my mind. I'm going to read the Noah and the flood account, and I'm going to see that behavior leads to chaos. The waters of chaos come crashing down into my life, and relationships are broken, and it causes all kinds of unneeded pain and wounds that don't even need to be there. So I'm going to change my mind. I'm just going to go talk to that person. And see, God changes his mind here. Humans don't change. God does. Isn't that amazing? And of course, being a Christian, following Jesus, is about imitating God. God was willing to change his mind. What happens here, God changes the way he deals with humans. I'm not going to destroy you with a flood anymore. God changes, and the way he changes his mind is to say, I'm going to put up with humans more. I'm going to be more patient. I'm not going to jump to washing them away with a flood. That's what happens in the story. God changes his mind. And the challenge for us is, are we willing to change our minds in the way we relate to people that are getting on our nerves or offending us or hurting us? And so I want to challenge you to do an exercise that I've been trying out this week. And if you'd like to write this down, you could. It's a very, very simple thing. This week at the end of the night, I've been praying something like this. God, search my heart. Just the quietness of the night. God, search my heart. And show me if I am harboring any kind of violence or corruption toward anybody else. If you'd like to write that down, it's a very simple prayer. God, search my heart. Show me if I'm harboring violence or corruption toward anybody else. And I'm embarrassed to tell you that I have been startled by what I saw. Viewing certain people this way or writing this person off and thinking, oh, this person, I don't really like the way they treated me, and startled by what I saw. And if I were to continue in that path, that could lead to all kinds of chaos, relational chaos in my life. But if I'm willing to say, you know what, God, would you help me to change my mind about that person and how offended I am or whatever it is, and would you help me to change my mind to where I don't act violently or with corruption towards them, but I am willing to be more patient with them, the way that you changed in the story of Noah and the flood. A couple of weeks ago, somebody came to me, a guy I really respect, came to me and we sat down over coffee, and he thought that he had offended me, and the truth is he hadn't. But he came to me and he said, hey, I just wanted to make sure that the air is clear between us. You know how rare that is? You know how much guts that takes and courage and how right and good that is? And we talked about some things, big manly hugs, after the meeting, and it was great. He didn't really need to do that from my perspective, but he had the courage to do it. And the commitment that I want to have not chaotic relationships with the people in my life. It's a simple decision that he made that took a lot of guts, but he did it. Would you be willing to try that exercise this week? So, as we move on in this series, the story of Noah and the flood has a lot to teach us for our relational lives in 2014. Would you be willing, it's been challenging for me, but would you be willing to create the habit of praying, God, search my heart and show me if I'm harboring violence or corruption towards anybody in my life. And God, I believe the truth of Noah and the flood, that will bring chaos that I don't even see coming. It'll take me by surprise. And God, would you help me to change my mind and view those people differently, and instead of viewing them with violence and corruption, would you help me to be more patient with them and to go to them in Matthew 18 Jesus style and try to make things right as far as it depends on me, that I could make peace and clean my side of the street. I think that's on the first week. That's one of the big lessons that we can take from Noah and the flood. Would you